Welcome back, brothers, to Hammer. Tonight's story, we got Perturabo, fresh from the Demon Prince transformation. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe from that beer. I want to thank you guys for the support. I've been killing it. Now, let's get to the video.
Vrax hung above its dead world, like a bullet suspended by the hand of a god that had forgotten mercy. Below it turned the corpse of a forge sphere, its atmosphere long ago boiled thin by wars no archive remembered in full. The planet's oceans had gone to poisoned seas, then to rust flats, then to nothing. Its manufactoria stood in ranks of blackened iron, cyclopean and blind, their stacks frozen, their assembly cathedrals split by old bombardments and wind-scoured into monuments of failure. No living fire burned there now save that which leaked from rent magma veins beneath the crust and the occasional bloom of promethium where buried munitions still cooked off beneath ancient rubble. Above that grave wheeled Vrax. It was no natural moon. Once it may have been stone. That truth had been murdered under ages of fortification. Mountains had been hollowed and ribbed with bastion spines. Canyon mouths were plugged by gate citadels with jaws of adamant. Cathedral mines descended like throat shafts into the dark, each one armored, sanctified, and watched by gun towers whose machine spirits had known only vigilance and murder for longer than nations survived. The outer crust was studded with macro batteries, lance silos, missile crypts, void shield shrines, auger domes, and sealed transit mazes through which armies could move unseen. Its poles were ringed with orbital defense crowns. Its equator was a wound of trenchworks and parapets, wide enough for armored columns to drive 10 abreast into the guns. And deeper than all of that, far below the hab warrens, powder vaults, slave pits, and command sepulchres, there ran sealed shafts, descending into blackness no common soul was permitted even to name. In the mouths of those shafts stood gates of null-etched adamantium. Upon those gates there were no sigils of ownership, no proud commemorations, no dedicatory hymns to guild or forge or saint. There were only ward runes and the old seal of terror, struck so deep it looked less engraved than branded into the metal by judgment itself. Those shafts led down to the Basilicon vault. Men had killed for the rumor of it before they had ever seen Vrax. Men would kill for it again before the world's turning was done. The defenders knew better than to speak of rumor aloud. They did not name the vault unless necessity flayed the word from them. They did not discuss what slept beneath the moon, nor what half-mythic engines had been entombed there in the age when the Emperor still walked among men and the Legiones Astartes were young and unbroken. Even silence on Vrax had become a form of worship. Tribune Kazor Helion stood within the oculus chamber of the inner citadel and watched the void through armored crystal thicker than a tank's glacis. Gold light burned over him in fractured reflections from the shrine lamps. His auramite plate held that light and returned it colder. Every edge of his armor was the line of a verdict. Every movement was precise enough to seem preordained. He was not large by the measure of transhuman breeds alone. He was large by the measure of certainty. The long haft of his guardian spear rested against one shoulder. His helm remained mag-locked at his hip, for no poison the moon could exhale, no miasma of war, no radiation bloom, no industrial contagion had ever yet been fashioned that the gene craft of the 10,000 could not master. Around him stood the survivors of his shield host. There were not many of them, by the measure of wars. There were enough, by the measure of consequences. Custodian wardens stood at the chamber's cardinal points, like golden execution statues, axes grounded, robes stained dark, where blood not their own had dried and cracked. Sentinel guardians held the approaches beyond the blast doors. In the galleries above, silent shapes in red and gold kept watch over tactical hololiths, Auspex returns, and litany scrolls streaming from the moon's hidden sensoriums. No one spoke without purpose. No one shifted from fatigue. Their vigilance was not duty worn as burden. It was their nature, and had been since before most civilizations had first raised walls. Helion looked not at the moon beneath him, but at the populations marked in descending script to the right of the Tactica display. Bond serfs in the lower trench manufactoria, pit miners in the ventral extraction catacombs, penal cohorts confined to assault barracks beneath the equatorial bastions, garrison thralls in hive cluster redoubts, half-mechanized labor castes in the sump habs along the ashward hemisphere. Billions, a tithe of expendability carved into flesh. They were already dying. Men died beneath collapsed trench roofs where the stones sweated toxins. Men died unloading shells too large for human limbs to manage without exobraces, and were pulped when chain hoists snapped. Men died in reactor crypts, where the coolant chants were spoken a heartbeat too slow. Men died in the manufactorum holds where they welded breech plate over doors they would never be permitted to open. Men died of exposure, contamination, punishment, machinery, hunger, crushing fatigue, and the casual corrective violence of overseers who had long ago forgotten difference between discipline and cruelty. They died by the million on Vrax in peace. What would war make of them? Helion's gaze lingered on the population runes for a moment more, and then moved away. Pity had no use here. Neither did waste. The Emperor had not sent him to preserve a moon. He had sent him, through chains of oath older than memory, to preserve denial. If Vrax had to drown in its own dead for the secret beneath it to remain buried, then Vrax would drown. A captain of the Mortal Defense Command stood at the edge of the chamber, permitted near only by writ and necessity. His coat was ash-grey, his face cratered by old chemical burns, one eye replaced by a brass augmetic that clicked as it focused and unfocused in Helion's direction. He had been waiting to speak for the span of 3 breaths. Helion acknowledged him with the slightest turn of the head. The officer bowed at once. "Tribune, the lower hab clusters are reporting renewed panic. The rumors are spreading faster than the sensors can excise them." "What form do they take?" Helion asked. The man hesitated, not from ignorance, from the simple instinct by which lesser beings stalled before delivering filth into sacred air. "That the vault beneath the moon contains engines from the Emperor's own hand. That should the enemy come, such weapons will be brought forth." Helion said nothing. Encouraged by the silence, the officer continued. "Some are saying they are planet-killer arrays. Others speak of fortress breakers, sun cages, world burners, devices hidden because no age of man could be trusted with them." "Those who repeat such words," said Helion, "are to be taken." "Yes, Tribune. They are to be questioned, and then they are to vanish." The officer swallowed. "At once." He withdrew. His boots rang too loudly against the chamber floor. Mortal noise always sounded clumsy in places shaped for greater things. One of the wardens turned his helm a fraction. "Rumor thrives where understanding is denied." "Understanding is not their right," Helion replied. The warden inclined his head in assent. That was the end of it. The first warning came not as vox traffic, nor as a prayer from the moon's augur priests, but as a change in the light beyond the armored glass. Stars vanished. They did not flicker out. They were simply taken away, one by one, then in swaths, then in whole cataracts of darkness, as something vast and layered eclipsed them. The void before Vrax became iron night. Hololithic displays bloomed with crimson contacts so numerous the machine spirits needed several heartbeats to classify, rank, and order them. Then the tactical chamber filled with alarm cant, warning chimes, invocation code, and Binharic screams. Helion did not move. Around Vrax, the Iron Warriors had come. The first ships were grand cruisers with prows like fortress rams, slab-sided and cruel. Behind them came siege tenders, armor caskets, void hulks plated over into traveling bastions, munition arcs, orbital foundries dragging chains of docked attack craft, and slave flotillas so densely packed that they cast a shoal shadow over the moon's upper hemisphere. Iron-sided transports moved in disciplined blocks, each screened by escorts and gun monitors. Between the hulls drifted things that had no place in clean creation: caged engine demons burning in warded frames, weapon beasts bound in hexagrammatic chainage, and black barges whose holds reeked of living cargo and sacrificial stock. No fleet of raiders this, no frenzy of a warband. This was a moving theorem of siege. On the flagship at the heart of that vastness, the Iron Blood, the Lord of Iron watched his conquest unfold. Perturabo did not sit a throne. He occupied a strategium that had been remade around his will until it seemed less chamber than extension of his mind. Iron ganglia ran through the deck and walls alike, pulsing with furnace-red light. Chains descended from a darkness lost in smoke. Suspended sensors bled metallic vapor. Bound things muttered behind grillwork. The air carried the scent of hot brass, machine oil, ozone, and the sweet rot of the warp held on a leash of mathematics and spite. He stood before a cyclopean display sphere in armor that was no longer holy armor. Demon-forged plate sheathed him in slabs of blackened iron traced with volcanic glow. Hazard chevrons, once symbols of legion discipline, now looked like ritual scars cut into the hide of a god. Cables like coiled serpents fed into his warplate. Great horns rose from the silhouette of his helm, not the feral antlers of madness, but the grim architecture of an ascension hammered into shape by an intelligence that had never surrendered itself to mere bestiality. He seemed made from fortress walls given hunger. Warsmith Cordax Vul stood below the Primarch's gaze and felt, as all lesser beings felt, the crushing humiliation of scale. Around him clustered Iron Circle commanders, siege savants, warpsmiths and gunslaves, all silent, all waiting. Perturabo extended one taloned gauntlet toward the image of Vrax. "Stone," he said, and his voice filled the strategium like iron dragged over tomb lids. "Is only obedience made visible. Break the stone, and the obedience breaks with it." No one answered. Nothing so crude as acclamation would have survived long in his presence. He traced firing arcs across the display with one claw tip, defensive bastions lit in sequence, shield nodes, counter-battery emplacements, kill channels, void harmonics, minefield drifts, landing vectors. All of it was ingested, judged, and reduced. "I do not want the moon," he said. "I want what the moon means. I want the principle beneath the wall. I want the thought that buried weapons in darkness and called the burial wisdom." Cordax bowed his head. "By your will, Primarch." Perturabo's helm turned a fraction. "Do not waste the phrase on piety, Warsmith. This is labor." He gestured. The order runes cascaded through the strategium. The first wave launched. Not the true assault. That would come after knowledge, after measurement, after blood had written data where auspex might lie. Thousands upon thousands of landing craft detached from the fleet in ordered shelves of descent. They plunged toward Vrax under howling engines, while the moon's defense grid awakened in full wrath. Macro batteries fired, orbital lances stabbed, missile cathedrals vomited flame. Whole shoals of the descending craft vanished in white blossoms of detonation. Others sheared apart, tumbling in molten halves. Yet still, they fell. Cordax understood then. They all did. This was sacrifice as instrument. The Primarch was feeding men, iron and munitions into the teeth of Vrax in order to map every gun line, every shield harmonic, every hidden reserve of fire. Each burst of destruction refined the calculations. Each wreck spinning down through atmosphere was another line of truth written across his tactical display. A warpsmith dared to speak. Losses exceed useful tolerance. Perturabo did not even look at him. Useful to whom? The warpsmith fell silent. On Vrax, the upper skies became a rain of iron and screaming. Burning hulls drew red scars through the atmosphere. Some transports survived long enough to vomit their cargo into firestorms on the outer glacis. Those troops died in heaps upon the landing zones, cut apart by interlocked defense batteries before they could even orient upon the ground. Others lived just long enough to drag telemetry beacons into the mud before shellfire converted them to wet ruin. In the lower trenches, the bond serfs and gun slaves watched the heavens burn and understood, in the animal depths of themselves, that this was only the beginning. Helion watched the carnage from the inner citadel and knew the same. The Iron Warriors had not come to test strength. They had come to learn the shape of resistance, so they might dismantle it with the patience of engineers and the malice of murderers. Then, a second fleet translation warning rippled through the command galleries. It was different from the first. No screaming surge of traitor mass, no shroud of slave transports, no brazen flood of siege craft. These arrivals came under sealed authority chains and signal obfuscation protocols of a kind that overrode local command, sidestepped fortress augurs, and stamped denial sigils over every request for immediate identification. The ships emerged in disciplined silence beside the custodian fleet, bronze prows cutting the dark like spearheads, strike cruisers, heavy escorts, assault carriers plated in old scars, and the arrogance of sanctioned violence. The Minotaurs had come. Only then did murmurs begin among the mortal command staff. Only then did outrage smolder through the inner galleries of Vrax's defense hierarchy, because Terra had sent not petition, not explanation, but force. Another blade hidden up the sleeve of the throne. Hours later, with the Void War tightening and the first sacrificial descent still burning in the night below, the master of the Minotaurs walked into the inner citadel of Vrax under sealed writ and armed escort. Asterion Moloch wore his war plate like a sentence imposed on the weak, bronze and sable, massive even for an Astartes, scarred, gouged, and marked by old wars whose proper end had always been slaughter at close range. The weapon at his side looked less carried than barely restrained. The helmet mag-locked at his hip wore the blank, bull-like brutality of his chapter's wrath. Nothing in him suggested deference. Nothing in him suggested he had come to serve another's command with good grace. Helion met him in a transit hall of black stone and gold sigils, beneath vault seals older than both their orders. Custodian guard lined one side of the hall in statuesque silence. Minotaurs lined the other, broad-shouldered and predatory, every helm facing forward, every gauntlet close to weapon grips. It would have taken only one false breath to turn the chamber into an abattoir. Helion stopped a spear's length from Moloch. Moloch stopped a sword's reach from Helion. For a moment neither spoke. Two different violences measured each other. One was the violence of sacred precision, of judgment rendered without doubt. The other was the violence of sanctioned brutality, of battering rams and mailed fists, sent where politics wished walls to break, but preferred not to name the deed. At last, Helion said, "You are here under writ." Moloch's gaze did not so much meet the custodians as strike it. "I am here because writ is not enough." The war did not begin with fury, it began with subtraction. Warsmith Kordax Vul watched it unfold upon the Strategium hololith and felt, despite himself, the old and terrible reverence crawling in his secondary heart. Vrax still burned with all the lights of vigilance then. Orbital bastions glimmered in rigid crowns. Auspex Cathedra pulsed in patient sequences across the fortress moon's scarred face. Vox relay spires winked in disciplined chains from pole to pole. Defense stations held formation around the moon like mailed fists around a relic. Then Perturabo unmade the pattern. The Primarch stood before the hololith vast and immovable, iron made into judgment. Red furnace light crawled through the seams of his demon-forged plate. The machine spirits of the Strategium whimpered in binharic fragments when he drew too near, then steadied themselves, as if ashamed to have betrayed fear before him. Around the Chamber, warpsmiths, gun savants, signal adepts, and legion officers stood in locked silence. No one dared offer counsel. Counsel implied incompletion. Perturabo did not require completion from lesser minds. He required obedience. He moved one talon across the projected void in a motion so slight it barely seemed motion at all. Bastion 19 fell dark beneath a storm of targeted lance fire from the Iron Warrior's Grand Cruisers. Before the station's distress cant had even propagated through the network, a relay chain on the opposite hemisphere vanished under a wave of torpedoes packed with machine plague and signal disruption charges. 3 outer monitor forts turned to engage the wrong vector, obeying phantom data fed into their auger shrines by scrap code seeded hours before through blind transmission ghosts. A cordon of defense cutters broke formation to answer a false breach warning. They died isolated, each one cut apart by waiting escorts before the captains understood they had been maneuvered not by force, but by arithmetic. Perturabo's voice filled the chamber. Blind the eyes, silence the tongue, cut the nerves, let each limb learn it is alone. Kordax bowed his head. The gesture was instinctive. He hated that it was instinctive. There were moments in the Primarch's presence when hatred, awe, and fear became too tightly twisted to separate. The Lord of Iron did not wage war as other beings waged war. Others imposed strength against resistance. Perturabo observed a structure, found the single hidden law by which it maintained itself, and then murdered that law. What followed was not battle, it was collapse. Across the hololith, the void around Vrax slowly emptied of discipline. Bastions could not triangulate. Auspec's cathedra received no confirming returns. Vox traffic stuttered, thickened, then broke into islands of panic and clipped command bursts that went nowhere. One defense station lost power to a shield bleed and called for redirection from a sister platform already dead. Another kept firing into the same empty volume for half an hour because its machine spirit still believed the fleet was where it had been 10 minutes before. Each one died alone. Kordax felt his fear sharpen when he realized the Primarch had done all of it with restraint. There was no bellowing wrath, no grand display of monstrous appetite. Perturabo had not yet become violent by his own standards. This was merely the preparation of violence. The first surface descent commenced under that torn and stammering shield of void defense. Landing craft, drop barges, shell transports, and heavy lifter arcs poured from the belly of the fleet in descending shelves. They came by the legion. Trench serfs huddled in chains within open cage decks. Siege engineers sat strapped into impact couches surrounded by drills, breaching augers, and bundled lengths of razor wire. Cult-armored auxilia clutched their weapons in silence and whispered to the iron icons, hanging from their gorgets. Gun servitors stood locked upright in magnetic racks, eyes rolled white behind target augmetics as munition catechisms were burned into their electro-fettered brains. Artillery crews rode down among the great wheels and hydraulic limbs of their guns, hands resting upon cold iron like priests, touching reliquaries. Below them waited fire. Vrax opened its macro batteries. The fortress moon's crust flashed in strings of white agony. Whole waves of descent craft disappeared. Iron hail and fuel flame rained through the atmosphere. Hulks struck the outer glacis and burst open, throwing men, machinery, and shells across black stone in storms of wreckage. Other craft hit the trenches still intact and vomited forth their cargo into murderous order. Trench serfs stumbled into the mud and were clubbed upright by overseers before they could cower. Siege engineers vanished under shell bursts before their equipment had fully cycled from transit lock to deployment mode. Gun servitors were planted knee-deep in slime and corpse matter, their heavy weapons already firing before their transport struts had finished collapsing. Then came the demon engines. They were lowered on chainage from slab-sided assault barges into iron cradles gouged with ward sigils and electrobrand hexes. Bound mauler forms and siege beasts writhed against their restraints, furnace maws venting cinders and blood steam. Their iron hides clanged and sparked where the chains bit deep. They looked hungry, even in stillness. They looked like starvation given limbs and told to wait. The Legion's beast handlers spoke the codes of release through metal vox grills, and each syllable sounded like an insult hurled at creation. Kordax tracked the landing matrices and saw losses approaching absurdity. Millions were already dead, or soon would be. Yet the beachheads thickened. Fire lanes that had been empty moments before were now clogged with artillery tractors, trench boring. Crawlers, ammo haulers, shield pylons, prefabricated revetments, and the first slithering lines of razor-wire deployment teams. The Iron Warriors did not land like invaders. They landed like a disease, teaching the body how it would be consumed. He glanced up at Perturabo. The Primarch had not once looked away. On Vrax, the defenders answered in two different tongues. Tribune Caesar Hellion spoke the older one. The command vault beneath the inner citadel smelled of incense, hot circuitry, and the faint acid tang of stressed shield generators. Hololithic front maps shifted through layers of red, amber, and funeral white. Mortal officers crowded the lower galleries. Custodian sentinels and wardens stood above them in statuesque silence. Hellion was still in armor. He had not removed his helm since the first descent pattern had begun. His voice came through the Guardian Plate's vox grill clean and cold. Yield the outer glacis. Cut the causeways in sequence. Preserve munitions. Preserve power. Withdraw only when denial value is exhausted. A human general, grey with ash and exhaustion, stared up at him. Tribune, if we trade all that ground, then the enemy will emplace guns within range of the second ring. They will emplace guns regardless. Then we should counter-strike now. Hellion turned his head slightly. No, we spend men only where expenditure protects the vault. I will not feed urgency with lives. Another voice answered him. Not human, not patient. You mistake restraint for control. Asterion Moloch stood at the far edge of the chamber, surrounded by bronze-armored giants, whose presence offended the geometry of the place by sheer brute intent. The Minotaurs had arrived without splendor, and had immediately made themselves felt as a pressure in every corridor they occupied. Their officers did not soften their boots upon sacred stone. Their serfs bullied local quartermasters. Their armor columns pushed for priority. Transit before the dead had even been cleared from the lanes. Even at rest, they looked like a chapter built for the private resentments of distant masters. Moloch advanced one pace toward the tactical display. His armor bore fresh impact, scoring from void insertion and surface transit. He looked less like a commander attending council than a siege ram given speech. If you let them dig, you deserve the wall falling on you, he said. Hellion did not rise to the bait. I deserve nothing. I preserve what I was sent to preserve. And I was sent to break the hand reaching for it. You were sent under writ. Moloch's helm lenses burned dull red in the strategium light. Writ is the excuse. Killing is the purpose. The mortal officers said nothing. Fear made them wise. Hellion looked back to the hololith. The outer ground is not sacred. Moloch placed one gauntlet upon the display plinth. The metal groaned beneath the weight. Ground becomes sacred when the enemy uses it to kill you. The custodian's reply was level, spoken like an Astartes. Moloch gave a sound that might almost have been a laugh, if laughter could be murdered and hammered flat. Spoken like one who intends to survive the next hour. He turned away from the chamber before permission was given. His captains followed. Hellion let him go. One of the wardens beside the tribune said, "He will countermand local withdrawals." "He will do what he was made to do," Hellion answered. "So will we." The first great bombardment began before the hour had turned. It opened with range-finding salvos from newly emplaced Iron Warrior batteries on the outer plains, then escalated without pause into a sustained annihilation. Macro shells shrieked down from orbit and roared in from the surface lines alike. Siege mortars lofted shells the size of shrine chapels over mountain ridges and into hab clusters. Lance strikes bored glowing wounds into fortress walls. Magma charges burst beneath trenchworks and folded them inward, burying men alive beneath slabs of burning stone. Mountain faces split, hab cities flattened, transit tunnels collapsed under their own convulsing load. The dead were not recovered. There was no time for such tenderness. They were simply churned into the lips of fresh trenches by dozer blades and siege crawlers, until Vrax itself seemed to be making mortar from the bodies of its defenders. The hours became days. The days ceased to mean anything. Shells fell without count. Cordax descended with the second command wave to a forward siege bastion built from the husks of 5 ruined landers and the fused wrecks of 2 breached gun crawlers. From there, he watched the war grow teeth. Trench serfs hacked firing steps into corpse-soaked mud with entrenching blades, while shells burst among them. Artillery crews manhandled breech cannons into revetments and died where they stood when counter-battery fire found the range. Auxilia. Cohorts pushed sacrificial probes into kill zones simply to draw hidden batteries into speaking. Servitors dragged shell racks through drifts of severed limbs and pulverized masonry. The sky never cleared. The ground never stopped shaking. Vrax groaned like a living thing being disassembled, while still awake enough to feel it. And yet the moon struck back. The first sign of the Custodes came as a silence in one sector of the bombardment. A shield-drained cathedral, one of the great industrial sanctums through which a portion of Vrax's void network was bled, regulated, and redirected, ceased all outward transmission. Its anti-boarding turrets fell quiet. Its perimeter guns fired one final scattered volley and then died. Cordax was studying the anomaly when picked feeds from infiltrator skulls flickered into life. Auramite. Nothing else in the galaxy reflected flame like that. Gold shapes moved through smoke and machine vapor with impossible exactitude. There were no wasted motions, no shouted zeal, no swagger. Custodian guard dropped through the broken upper vaults of the shield-drained cathedral on gravitic insertion wakes and immediately made slaughter look like a liturgy of perfect cuts. One split a gun servitor and the loader chained to it in the same thrust. Another drove his blade through the faceplate of a traitor officer and killed the 2 men behind him when the exit burst of power sheared through their torsos. A third took the recoil chamber off a breech cannon with one downward cut, then rammed the sparking ruin into the nearest cluster of Iron Warriors Auxilia. Blood mist and incandescent machine oil sprayed the chapel columns. Men died without ever properly seeing what had reached them. Those few legionaries present fought back with disciplined wrath and were cut apart in heartbeats. Then the Custodes were gone again, vanishing through lower smoke bays and maintenance crypts before heavy response elements could close. They left the cathedral ruined, its generators slagging out in violent discharge, its garrison butchered so completely that the floor looked lacquered red and black beneath the warning lumen glare. Cordax felt his mouth go dry behind his helm, not from surprise, from the horrible intimacy of the thing. The Custodes had not counterattacked a line. They had reached into the war, severed one artery, and withdrawn before the body understood it was bleeding. When the Minotaurs answered, they answered like artillery given flesh. A causeway linking 2 outer bastions had been lost during the 3rd night of bombardment, its approaches drowned in rubble, shell holes, and the dead of 3 failed counter-thrusts by local garrison troops. The Iron Warriors had already begun to run ammunition sledges and shield wagons across it beneath suppressive fire. Cordax marked it for fortification and expected the usual attritional contest. Instead, the Auspex screens bloomed with the signatures of heavy armor surging from the inner. Gate lines, land raiders first, then assault tanks, then dense wedges of bronze plate and moving ceramite behind them, terminators at the core, breachers on the flanks. The Minotaurs did not nibble at the wound. They drove their whole mailed fist into it. Bolter fire drowned the causeway. Breacher charges turned revetments inside out. Demolisher blasts flung gun servitors into the air in pieces. The Minotaurs came through the smoke like executioners, who had been denied their proper hour, and now meant to collect interest. They did not maneuver elegantly. They smashed, they ground, they advanced over their own wrecks, and the enemy's bodies alike. Chain blades screamed at point-blank range. Power axes hacked through shield walls. Legion auxilia were blown apart in heaps and then buried beneath the boots of advancing terminators. One bronze giant took a direct hit from a heavy breach shell that tore away half his pauldron and most of the arm beneath it. He kept coming until he could reach the gun crew. Then there was nothing left of them but meat against iron. Moloch rode at the heart of it, not mounted, not exalted, simply there where the killing thickened most. His voice cracked over the command bands when one of his captains reported the breach stalled beneath intersecting fire. "Give me the breach," he said. "I will mortar it with their dead." Then the Minotaurs surged again, and the causeway disappeared under the violence of their reclaiming advance. By the time the exchange ended, the span belonged to the loyalists once more. It was barely recognizable as a structure. It looked like a charnel trench raised above the ground. Bodies were packed into the broken stone so densely that tracks and boots found purchase on flesh where rock had been blasted away. Burnt promethium ran through the corpse layers in little blue streams. The Minotaurs were already reinforcing over the dead, planting guns among the dismembered, using the slain exactly as their master had promised. Kordax transmitted lost tallies to the Iron Blood and received only silence in answer. That silence chilled him more than rebuke. It meant Perturabo had already accounted for the price and found it neither surprising nor important. Later, when the bombardment eased from apocalyptic to merely unendurable, and the smoke over the lines turned the color of bruised iron, Kordax was summoned to the Primarch's forward observation sanctum aboard the Iron Blood. Through an armored oculus, the war on Vrax glowed beneath them, whole mountain chains flashing under gunfire, trench grids lit in ember red, bastions blinking in and out of existence under the steady murder of artillery. Perturabo stood with his hands clasped behind him. Kordax knelt. "Lord, you have seen them now," said the Primarch, "the Custodes and the Minotaurs, Lord. I have seen what they are." Perturabo's gaze remained on the moon. "The gold ones do not fight for ground. They fight for denial. Every blow they strike is made in service to something hidden. They are the lock." Kordax kept silent. Perturabo continued, his tone calm, almost bored in its certainty. "The bronze ones are simpler, brutal, useful, thrown where a lesser regime wishes to call savagery policy. They are not purpose, they are impact, a hammer." At last he turned his horned helm a fraction toward the kneeling warsmith. "And a hammer," he said, "is merely something another hand has swung." By the 7th day of unbroken bombardment, men on both sides had forgotten what silence was and begun to dream in impact patterns. Warsmith Kordax Fool stood upon the upper gallery of a forward siege tower assembled from the ribs of wrecked landers and the armored backs of slave haulers, and watched 1,000,000 worthless lives spent to purchase a single useful truth. The Primarch had ordered false hunger across the whole breadth of the war. Not feints in the crude sense, not gestures meant merely to distract. Perturabo did not insult the enemy with pantomime. He made each deception into a battle large enough to earn its own histories, then fed those histories into the furnace of his actual design. Entire trench cities of serfs, cult armored auxilia, and penal stock were driven toward bastions the Legion had no intention of truly taking. Artillery parks were assembled in the open, where Vrax's guns could reach them. Only so the fortress would expose hidden batteries in the act of their destruction. Breaching columns dug toward walls that would never be assaulted, and died in subterranean cave-ins or under floods of liquid fire, while the true siege lines advanced elsewhere under cover of dust storms, smog tides, and nights so thick with radfall that mortal skin blistered through sealed masks. Billions died in that widening darkness. They died screaming praises to gods that had never loved them. They died under the whips of taskmasters who drove them forward at gunpoint. They died faceless and mute in sealed tunneling rigs when void-hardened rock collapsed like an executioner's fist. They died with their hands still on the ropes of field guns they had dragged through corpse mud for half a day, only to vanish in the flash of a single macro shell. Their deaths were not mourned. Their deaths were measurements. Kordax had once believed himself long hardened against the waste of men. The long war taught such lessons quickly, yet even he felt the scale of it in his bones. The false objectives had become charnel kingdoms of their own. Across the outer plains of Vrax, smoke pillars climbed into the poisoned heavens from sacrificial offensives still chewing themselves to pieces, and everywhere beneath them, the real work continued. That was where the Primarch's genius lived. Not in slaughter, though he possessed that in abundance. Not in wrath, though his bitterness could have drowned stars. His genius lived in patience sharpened to an edge so fine it could flense a world. The real instruments of conquest came forward on tracked mountain crawlers and in the bellies of subcrustal moles. Grav borers the size of shrine spires were lowered into newly won trenches with chains thicker than a man's torso. Siege claws unfolded like the limbs of metal arachnids and bit into revetments with adamantine teeth. Magma cutters, shielded in slabs of black iron and caged furnace wards, were dragged into position by chained teams of penal oxen and bellowing servitors. Demon-bound tunnelers were released beneath the night mud under the barked code of their masters, each one a writhing horror of drill mouths, piston limbs, and meat-fed machine appetite. Trench mortars were emplaced in dense batteries behind the forward redoubts, their crews working knee-deep in shell slime and severed limbs. Fortress killer shells, engraved with equations of desecration and warded with profane sigils, were rolled from iron caissons by chanting gun adepts who kissed the brass casings as though touching saintly relics. Everywhere Kordax looked, the Legion was becoming itself. He felt pride then, black and painful in his chest, pride in the old way, pride in the Fourth, as it had once been, and, in crueler truth, as it remained still. Others raided, others despoiled, others called their savagery freedom and pretended at kingship from the backs of chance victories. The Iron Warriors built defeat around their enemies one measured layer at a time. They were not merely coming for Vrax, they were teaching it the shape of its inevitable ruin. A shell burst struck the parapet below his vantage and threw red mud up over the gallery in a wet sheet. A serf officer lost his face to the fragmentation burst and fell backward without a sound. Kordax did not spare him a glance. His optics were fixed on the outer curtain wall. The wall had stood since before the first men now dying below it had known language in any shape that mattered. It was not elegant. Elegance had no place on Vrax. It was colossal, ugly, and deliberate. Layer upon layer of armored stone, void shield veins, firing galleries, internal choke passages, blast wells, retractable gun housings, and buried support routes driven down into the moon's tortured bones. It had already survived days of punishment enough to shatter city hives. Now it began, at last, to fail. The first true breach was not a single moment, but a succession of wounds multiplying faster than repair rites could answer them. One section of the wall bulged outward under subterranean force as demon tunnelers detonated their bound cores beneath it. Another sagged where magma cutters had eaten its hidden spine. Fortress killer shells struck within seconds of one another, each hit throwing a fresh cataract of stone, iron, and pulverized men into the void below. Defensive fire intensified, crossed, and thickened into a murderous lattice. Then a whole curtain segment split from top to base, with the sound of a world opening its throat. The breach became a funnel of death before the dust had settled. Regiments disappeared in minutes there, not defeated, not driven back, erased. The first waves of slave infantry and expendable auxilia vanished beneath overlapping defensive fire from both flanks. Men were blown apart by enfilading heavy bolters, then crushed beneath slabs of collapsing masonry large enough to flatten tanks. Behind them came more bodies, because there was nowhere else for them to go. The pressure of the assault itself trampled the fallen into the rubble underfoot. Wounded men screamed and reached from beneath layers of the newly dead, only to be ground into the breach floor by advancing boots, tank tracks, and the iron-shod feet of legionaries forcing the attack onward. Cordax voxed corrections to his line captains and received only fragments in answer, the channels drowned in static, prayer, and screams. Through the smoke, he saw the Custodes. There was no heralding cry, no clangor of vaunted arrival, no performative declaration of loyalty and wrath, such as common Astartes loved to spend breath upon. Golden figures emerged through side access passages, revealed by the wall's collapse, descending into the breach as though the slaughter there had been prepared solely for their use. Their movements were so exact, they seemed unreal amid the lunacy around them. One drove a guardian spear through an Iron Warrior Terminator's gorget joint and withdrew it in the same motion, already turning to take the head from the next attacker with the bolter blade mounted beneath the weapon's haft. Another stepped through a detonation cloud, seized a charging siege thrall by the throat, and used the body as a shield against 3 point-blank shots before crushing the skull into paste and casting the corpse aside. A third walked directly into the path of a demon-bound breacher beast, let its iron mandibles close on his forearm shield, and then split the thing from brow to belly with a single downward cut that sprayed warp-lit ichor over the stones. There was no rage in them, no visible effort. They simply killed. Cordax had fought loyalists for centuries. He had broken chapters and butchered heroes. Yet the sight of the Custodes at close quarters chilled him in ways more familiar terror never could. Space Marines were violence trained into forms of discipline. These things were something colder. Executioners in a rite older than memory. Each death they dealt looked less won than already ordained. Then the Minotaurs came into the same hell and made of it an altogether different lesson. They did not emerge in quiet precision. They smashed their way into the breach through a collapsed service tunnel that saner commanders would have marked impassable. The tunnel roof was still falling as they advanced beneath it, bronze plates scraped raw by descending stone, shields raised, chain blades revving. One Minotaur captain was crushed from shoulder to hip by a dropping beam, and his squad simply stepped over the ruin of him, roaring their chapter's hatred through helm grills as they hit the first knot of traitor infantry. They fought with contempt for any calculation that did not end in contact. Bolter fire tore bloody lanes across the rubble. Breacher charges were hurled into firing nests barely 10 paces ahead. Power axes chopped through limbs, weapons, and broken shielding alike. They hacked themselves forward through kill zones and cave-ins where no rational tactician would have committed elite strength. Where the Custodes cut, the Minotaurs bludgeoned. Where the Custodes moved like verdict, the Minotaurs moved like punishment. The breach became worse because both were in it. Cordax saw Iron Warrior squads trying to reform around the fallen shell of a transport, only to be taken from opposite sides, precise gold on one flank and bronze savagery on the other. The Legion's human auxiliaries broke, first, then were driven forward again by the muzzles of their overseers. Demon engines burst through the smoke, dragging chains and gore, only to die in shrieking ruin beneath melter fire and guardian spear thrusts. At one point, the entire floor of the breach shifted under the accumulated weight of corpses, collapsing into an ammunition culvert below and swallowing men from all factions alike into a subterranean furnace bloom. Vrax was devouring whoever stood upon it. Deep beneath the fighting, in chambers unmarked on any line officer's chart, Tribune Kazor Helion stood before the triune gate of a hidden sanctum and learned precisely how narrow his duty had become. The chamber was old in the way things from Terra were old, not merely ancient, but made under an authority no one now living could honestly comprehend. Black stone drank the lumen glow. Null wards hummed within the walls like distant teeth grinding. Before Helion rose 3 concentric doors of auric steel and adamantium veinwork, each engraved with seals, only half visible beneath layers of ritual occlusion. The adepts who had kept the chamber's rites were dying one by one in the wider war. The last of them, a skeletal magos bound into a throne of copper and prayer paper, spoke through a mouth grill clogged with incense ash. "The Basilicon vault does not open by command alone," it whispered. "It is a triune denial engine, gene-coded blood seals, command sigils, master induction array, 3 sanctums, 3 truths required, 1 body cannot open it, 1 order cannot unmake it." Helion said nothing. The magos turned one lens toward him. Should 1 sanctum fail, the vault remains closed. Should 2 fail, the vault remains closed. Should all be compromised, the denial sequence may still be invoked from the innermost heart, if one bearing the proper sigils yet lives. "Where are the sanctums?" the machine priest answered. One lay beneath the polar ward shrines, buried in a frozen coil of old command architecture. One nested under the central blood catacombs, where gene-tithe crypts and bloodline archives were kept beneath seals of imperial antiquity. The last, the master induction array, lay nearest the vault itself, in a chamber warded against both machine and mind. Helion absorbed the truth in silence. To hold the vault, he must now hold not 1 secret place, but 3, or else destroy them before they could be taken. Far above, aboard the Iron Blood, Perturabo learned the same secret in a more fitting tongue. Cordax was summoned not to the strategium this time, but to a chamber of unclean inquiry, where the Primarch had gathered captured engine seers and fortress magi taken in raids and tunnel penetrations over the previous days. They hung in restraint frames of iron and hooked silver, opened by scalpels, mechadendrites, and arts no oath-bound Mechanicus school would ever name aloud. Their skulls had been trepanned in careful geometries. Membrane. Filaments trembled in the air. Data smoke leaked from split cranial ports. One still screamed, though his lower jaw had been removed hours before. Another mouthed Binharic prayer through a tongue of copper wire. Blood and sacred unguents ran together into the floor grates. Perturabo moved among them like a smith examining ore. Warpsmiths labored under his direction, but not with the complacent swagger of masters secure in their craft. They worked as slaves work in the presence of the lash. One mago's mind had been unfolded into a fan of memory shards and thought circuit impressions suspended in stasis fields. Another had its soul stripped by techno-sorcerous extraction and pinned, shrieking invisibly, into an array of runic pylons. The answers were not taken by question. They were extracted by disassembly. At the end of it, the Primarch stood over the remains of the last captive, who no longer resembled a man so much as a torn casket from which every treasured thing had been removed. 3 locks, Perturabo said. Cordax bowed at once. Lord, blood, authority, induction, distributed, redundant, prudent in the old Terran way. The Primarch's tone held the ghost of something uglier than amusement. He hid the weapon, and then designed the hiding place as a sermon. Cordax kept his gaze lowered. Then the sanctums become primary objectives. No. Perturabo's gaze shifted to him, and that single attention felt like exposure before a forge furnace. They become inevitabilities. Objectives are for subordinates. This is a dissection. Within the inner citadel of Vrax, Helion and Moloch stood again in council, though the words scarcely described the thing between them. The chamber was smaller this time and more heavily sealed. Outside, bombardment shook dust from the arches. The defenders had fallen back by measured stages from the outer curtain line, but the breach still spat dead and fire into the moon's wounded body. Hellion had spoken the triune truth to no mortal commander. Moloch was the only one he judged too dangerous to keep ignorant. "If the sanctums are threatened," Hellion said, "they will be destroyed." Moloch's helm tilted by a degree. "Destroyed. The vault cannot be permitted. What the Emperor hid," said Moloch, "is not yours to erase. It is not yours to claim. It is the Emperor's." Hellion's voice hardened a fraction. "Then we deny it to all unworthy hands." Moloch took one step closer. He was close enough now that the bronze of his armor reflected in Hellion's polished auramite like dried blood in a blade. "You speak as though the 10,000 alone decide what remains worthy in his realm. I speak as one entrusted when trust itself was rare. I was not sent here to watch you bury victory beneath dogma. This is not victory." Moloch's gauntlet closed once, hard enough to creak. "You would destroy what might save a sector because you fear it being touched." Hellion answered without heat. "I would destroy 1,000 sectors before I let his enemies inherit what he judged too dangerous for ages better than this one." The silence after that was knife-thin. It was the first true crack between them. Neither missed it. When Perturabo descended to the breach for the first time, the war changed its breathing. The bombardment had eased only in the technical sense. Guns still fired, shells still fell, but some instinct older than command spread through the Iron Warrior lines when the Primarch's lander descended through the soot haze and settled amid the wreck fields below the shattered curtain wall. Legionaries ceased their barking orders. Trench serfs dropped to their knees in mud made from ash and human fat. Even the chained demon engines quieted for a handful of heartbeats, iron muscles shivering in their restraints, as though some greater predator had stepped into their hunting ground. Kordax approached through the smoke and saw his Gene father walk down the ramp. Perturabo was colossal in that light. Furnace glow burned between the plates of his armor and painted the drifting smoke red from within. His silhouette was all unholy angles, heavy slabs, iron horns, cables like spinal roots, and the impossible poise of something too vast to need haste. Vox static crawled over every open channel in his presence. Men nearby began to bleed from the eyes without understanding why. One gun servitor misfired catastrophically as its machine spirit spasmed at the Primarch's proximity, and the recoil blast tore the loader thrall behind it into wet halves. No one dared react. Kordax knelt in the mud. Around him the fourth knelt as well. Perturabo stepped over corpses, rubble, and still moving wounded without the slightest deviation in stride. He ascended the broken rise toward the curtain wall itself, now split open into a towering wound of collapsed galleries and blackened inner stone. Loyalist fire still lanced down from surviving redoubts deeper within. A shell burst on the far lip of the breach and showered the Primarch in rock fragments. They bounced from his armor like thrown sand. He reached the wall and laid one clawed hand upon it. For a moment, the whole war seemed to pause around that touch, as though Vrax itself had been made to understand who had come to judge it. Perturabo looked up into the broken heights, into the cracked galleries and wounded bastions, and the maze of defense works still hidden deeper behind them. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough that Kordax had to strain to hear it over the guns. "This fortress was built by minds lesser than mine," he said. "It is already dead. It simply has not finished falling." The loyalist counterstroke began at the hour when even the guns seemed weary. It came not as some elegant recovery of initiative, nor as the measured reply of a patient defense, but as a mailed convulsion thrown outward from the wounded body of Vrax. For days, the fortress moon had done nothing but bleed stone, bleed men, and yield ground in carefully measured handfuls beneath the iron arithmetic of the 4th Legion. The outer curtain was broken. The breach still smoked and shifted with the settling of dead masonry. The second defensive ring stood under gathering fire, while the Iron Warriors brought their true engines of reduction into range. Every augur return suggested what every sane commander would have named obvious. The defenders were tightening inward. Asterion Moloch had never been a sane commander. Warsmith Kordax Vul saw the first signs in the shuddering movement of the loyalist inner transit lines. At first, it seemed like another local reinforcement push, one more attempt to patch a firing lane or bolster a wall already marked for ruin. Then the returns thickened. Armored signatures multiplied. Heat blooms massed behind shuttered bastion mouths. Assault ramps dropped. Engine wakes flared in disciplined packs. Bronze came pouring through the wounds of Vrax in concentrations so dense they looked less like a deployment than the unclenching of a fist. The Minotaurs had committed almost everything. Kordax stood in the command cradle of a forward siege crawler and watched the loyalist assault columns break from cover. Land raiders ground over rubble slopes and corpse banks, their tracks biting through shell glass and splintered bone. Predator tanks followed in close support. Terminator telemetry burned bright at the center of each wedge, heavy and relentless. Breacher squads moved in dense shielded files between the armor hulls. Assault guns barked. Demolisher cannons flashed. The whole advance had the ugly honesty of a battering ram. There was no feigned subtlety in it, no pretense of finesse. The Minotaurs were not trying to outthink the siege. They meant to reach into it with both hands and tear out its throat. Forward. Trench forts manned by legion thralls and auxilia died first. Their prefabricated revetments burst apart under concentrated bombardment. Gun pits collapsed inward. Razor wire burns were flattened beneath tank tracks and then buried under the bodies of those trying to retreat through them. Minotaur breaches hit the first trench line before half its defenders had even managed to leave their dugouts. Bronze shields slammed into firing steps. Chain blades screamed in enclosed spaces. Power axes rose and fell with the workmanlike brutality of slaughterhouse tools. Men died kneeling in the mud, their heads split to the teeth, their chests opened in slabs by horizontal blows that carried through flesh, flak plate, and the bodies behind them. Those who fled were trampled under the boots of the attackers or shot in the back by their own overseers for desertion. At the center of it all moved Moloch. He led in Terminator plate, the color of old blood on beaten bronze, huge even among the giants around him. He came through the trench forts as though he despised the idea that they had ever offered resistance. One bunker at a time, he turned the forward line into a butcher yard. Kordax saw him mount the back of a siege crawler while its heavy stubbers still fired, tear open the upper hatch with his gauntlets, and hurl himself down into the crew space. The vehicle ran on blindly for another dozen heartbeats, its tracks crushing bodies and emplacement stakes alike, before the entire front plate blew outward in a fan of red ruin, and Moloch emerged from the steaming wreckage drenched in blood, carrying the severed head of the vehicle master by its vox-cabled spine. He cast the head into the trench and voxed one order, his voice a rasping hammer blow over every captured channel. "Drive!" The Minotaurs surged with renewed fury, yet that was only half the loyalist stroke. While the bronze storm smashed into the 4th Legion's forward siege works, Tribune Caesar Hellion struck, where the war's nerves were hidden. The Custodes did not announce themselves. There was no blunt armor rush, no roaring declaration over the vox, no weight of numbers. One moment, the Iron Warriors' rearward gun lines were functioning in the cruel perfection Perturabo demanded. Signal cores pulsed with relayed targeting data. Ammunition crypts cycled shells and plasma coils out toward the batteries. Warpsmith conclaves bound machine spirits and sharpened demon engines for timed release. The next moment, that order began to vanish in small surgical severings. A signal tower in the Ashwood Quarter cut out mid-transmission. Another answered its silence with a request for verification and received only static because its operator's skull had already been split by a Guardian spear. A warpsmith enclave beneath a shielded basalt overhang went dark after 3 heartbeats of internal vox screaming, and one final binharic burst so distorted it sounded like a machine trying to pray through a broken jaw. Ammunition crypts detonated, not because they had been shelled, but because golden figures had reached them from below and slaughtered everyone entrusted with venting the ignition rites. Kordax saw fragments of it on tactical relays. Never enough, never in time. Auramite giants descended through maintenance shafts and rubble chimneys into the rear of the siege line, killing exactly what mattered and wasting no motion on terror or theatre. One custodian cut down a 6-man signal command and then drove his spear through the central relay shrine to slag the machine spirit at its heart before moving on. Another tore the arms from a heavy servitor crew and used their own bodies to jam the elevation gears of a macro mortar. At a munitions crypt below the 3rd line, a squad of wardens entered through the smoke of a vent explosion, butchered the overseers, the shell handlers, the chained slaves, and the 2 iron warrior sergeants supervising them, then planted melter, charges against the stacked fortress killer rounds, and vanished into the underworks before the eruption took the chamber apart. For one glorious, hideous stretch of battle, the attackers were staggered. Macro cannon batteries went dark across a quarter of the prepared fire grid. Demon engines broke leash as ward pylons failed and handler packs were butchered. One bound siege beast turned in its cradle and devoured the men unchaining it, before hurling itself sideways into a trench mortar battery, splitting open the emplacements and trampling gunners into the shell slurry. Relay blindness spread. Artillery salvos began to land wide. Reserve redoubts fired late or not at all. The great grinding certainty of the Iron Warrior's advance faltered. Kordax felt it in the command channels like a tremor moving through iron. He hated the feeling. Hated it because it was real. Hated it more because part of him marveled at the sheer disciplined savagery of the thing. This was what the defenders became when they ceased merely absorbing the siege and chose instead to strike for its teeth. He voxed frantic redirections, reform the crawler cordon, re-establish signal chain through tertiary mast arrays, release reserve gun servitors to the western trench forts, seal the lower transit crypts, kill anything in gold on sight. Around him, the ground war became a vision from some engine saint's fevered hell. Mountains walked where tracked macro haulers dragged fresh batteries over ridgelines blasted flat by days of shelling. Trenches collapsed into furnace pits when underground Prometheum tanks were pierced by stray fire and turned the earth itself into a roaring mouth. Half-buried tanks kept firing even after landslides of rubble sealed them to their turrets, their crews cooking alive inside as the barrels continued their recoil litany. Flood channels filled with ash, blood, rendered fat, and powdered stone until the wounded drowned face down in mud that had once been men. Servitors crawled on with their lower halves gone, hauling shell chains with finger bones exposed and twitching. A damaged demon engine, split open from sternum to groin by melter fire, still managed to bite a Minotaur in half before collapsing in a fit of black sparks and leaking warp filth. Then Perturabo's answer arrived. It did not come in the form of panic. It did not come as a frantic redeployment improvised from wounded pride. The Lord of Iron had expected the counterstroke. More than that, he had fed it. Kordax learned the truth in the moment the Minotaurs, drunk on momentum and slaughter, drove through a captured trench fort and into ground too open to be accidental. For a handful of heartbeats, the way ahead looked naked. Abandoned revetments, crippled gun shields, a line of wrecked siege crawlers that seemed to promise exactly what Moloch would most desire, a route into the heart of the artillery belt before the second defensive ring could be fully encircled. The Minotaurs took the bait without hesitation. As the bronze wedges surged onward, hidden shutters in the ash cliffs above them fell away. Buried gun pits opened in the flanks of slag ridges that had seemed lifeless moments before. Crossfire erupted from intersecting galleries cut into the crater walls. Pre-sighted artillery, held silent until that exact instant, opened from 3 converging batteries. The ground beneath the attackers, already fractured by deliberate overmining, began to give way. Kill corridors. Kordax understood it all at once and felt a savage rush of relief so fierce it almost shamed him. Perturabo had left weakness where the Minotaurs would find insult irresistible. He had broken the forward line just enough. He had shown them prey and let their nature finish the trap. The corridor became a grinder. Shells fell in disciplined, overlapping patterns that folded the advancing wedges inward upon themselves. Land raiders vanished beneath cascading rock and precision lance strikes. Terminators were blown from their feet, buried, rose, and were buried again. Heavy bolter nests opened from both sides, stitching the kill lane with explosive death. The wrecked siege crawlers that had seemed mere debris detonated as their hidden munitions went up, showering the Minotaurs in burning iron. Whole cohorts disappeared in storms of shrapnel and pulverized stone. Yet they did not break. Moloch drove them onward by brutality of presence alone. He smashed through a collapsed artillery traverse, killed the crew of a heavy breech cannon with his own hands, and turned the weapon manually to fire point blank into an Iron Warrior reserve squad trying to seal the gap behind him. He boarded another siege crawler through the upper maintenance grill and left it a drifting coffin. He hacked his way bunker by bunker through redoubts that should have been impossible to clear under that degree of intersecting fire. Kordax moved to the forward command line to stabilize the trap with his own presence, surrounded by his chosen iron brethren and screened by gun servitors. He believed, for one fatal span of arrogance, that the Minotaurs had finally spent themselves. Then, Moloch reached him.
Remember, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support helps.
The master of the Minotaurs came through a curtain of smoke and shell sparks like some ancient execution idol hurled into life by hatred. Kordax fired first, his combi bolter barking mass reactive rounds that blew apart the 2 bronze giants beside Moloch and cratered the trench wall behind them. Moloch did not slow. He hit Kordax's guard line at full charge. One Iron Warrior Terminator lost his head and half his torso to the opening swing. Another was smashed from his feet so hard his spine shattered against the revetment behind him. Kordax brought up his servo claw and power maul together, catching Moloch's next blow in a shower of sparks and crackling fields. The impact drove him knee-deep into corpse mud. Moloch was stronger than he had any right to. B. Not as a Primarch was strong, not as a demon thing was strong, but with that dense, ugly, murderous strength possessed only by certain Astartes monsters who had spent whole centuries doing nothing but turning themselves into weapons. He broke Kordax's maul arm at the elbow with a backhand strike. He caved in the warsmith's chestplate with the next blow, the impact punching ceramite shards into both primary lungs. Kordax tried to answer with his servo claw, and managed only to shear away a plate edge from Moloch's shoulder before the Minotaur leader slammed him face first into the parapet, hard enough to pulp one eye behind his helm lens. He would have died there. Kordax knew it later with perfect, humiliating clarity. He would have died there like any other line officer dragged too close to a real killer. Only the weight of Iron Warrior reserves and the sudden implosion of a nearby munition trench, detonated by one of Helion's surviving strike elements in the rear, broke the duel apart. Fire and earth erupted between them. Kordax was flung backward in a rain of molten brass and blood. When his auto-senses steadied, Moloch was already gone into the smoke, still moving forward, still killing. Elsewhere the Custodes paid for their precision in gold and flesh. Helion's decapitation strike had cut deep, but one portion of the assault had gone wrong. A reserve gate beneath the signal quarter, expected to remain blind and sealed, opened under emergency command and released an entire counterboarding cohort of Iron Warriors Terminators and demon-fettered automata directly into the withdrawal lane of the Custodian attack force. Kordax saw the aftermath only in fractured reports and helmet recordings scavenged from the dead, but that was enough. The Custodes fought like beings made without the expectation of death. Every second they bought cost the Fourth a mound of corpses. They held a collapsed signal vault against impossible pressure, while Hellions, surviving warriors, completed the ruin of the relay core beyond. Golden bodies stood amid heaps of legionaries, battle automata, gun thralls, and dismembered servitors, each custodian wounded in ways that would have slain lesser transhumans many times over, and still killing with measured economy. One lost his spear arm and continued to fight with a misericordia in his offhand, opening throats and helm seals until a siege hammer crushed his spine. Another pinned a demon engine against a support column long enough for his brothers to fall back through the breach, then died under its tearing claws, with his blade still driven into its furnace throat. They were not invincible. Their deaths proved only that the price of each one was monstrous. By the time the smoke began to thin, the loyalist offensive had spent itself. The Minotaurs had torn out trench forts, burned siege engines, and left whole artillery belts in ruin. The Custodes had blinded signal chains, slaughtered warpsmiths, and broken a quarter of Perturabo's prepared fire plan. The Iron Warriors had answered by burying the attackers in pre-sighted death, crushing the counterstroke inside kill corridors built for exactly that appetite, and sealing most of the damage with layers of fresh corpses, iron, and guns. No side had what any sane species would call victory. Vrax merely had more dead. After the battle, Hellion found Moloch in a shattered command gallery overlooking the western breach fields. Bronze-armored survivors stood among piles of spent magazines and bloodied tools, rearming under the dim pulse of failing lumen strips. Custodian sentinels blocked the far arch. Every warrior in the chamber knew violence was one insult away. Hellion's armor was cut, scorched, and blackened where enemy blood had dried in the seams. Moloch looked scarcely more whole. Fresh score marks crossed his breastplate. One side of his helm was gone. The face beneath was a slab of scar tissue and old contempt. "You spent lives like a beast loosed in a meat hall," Hellion said. Moloch wiped a line of clotted blood from his jaw with the back of a gauntlet. "And you spent yours like coin counted by a corpse." The Minotaurs were sent to fight, not to glut themselves on attrition. "We broke his teeth. You broke against his trap." Moloch took one step down from the broken gun platform. "And your demigods bled themselves white for signal shrines and shell rooms." Hellion's grip tightened on his guardian spear. "Wasteful beasts." Moloch's answering smile was little more than a scar flexing. "The 10,000 have mistaken guardianship for ownership." For a moment it seemed the chamber itself held breath. Then Hellion said, very softly, "Remember to whom you speak." Moloch answered just as softly, and far more dangerously, "Remember what I was sent here to do." Neither moved further. It was enough. For now. Far above Vrax, in the furnace dark of the iron, blood, Perturabo gathered his inner circle around the wounded shape of Warsmith Kordax and spoke the deeper truth of the campaign. Kordax knelt despite the ruin of his chest and the pain flooding his armor interfaces. His rebuilt eye whirred in its socket. His left arm was gone from mid-bicep, replaced only by a sealed stump and the humiliation of incompletion. Around him stood warpsmiths, tyrant captains, signal magi, and the chosen officers of the siege. No one dared remark upon his mutilation. The Primarch's presence devoured all lesser discomfort. Upon the central hololith glowed the image of the Basilicon system, Vrax at its center, then a lattice of speculative chains reaching outward through dead sectors, lost forges, old Terran compliance routes, and the buried logic of Imperial denial architecture. "You think I have come for weapons?" Perturabo said. No one answered. "Of course I have come for weapons, but a weapon is only the visible portion of thought." "What Matters is the design logic, the method, the buried grammar of why this vault was made as it was made. He reached out and passed one claw through the projection of the triune lock system. Blood seal, command sigil, induction array. The runes split and multiplied, becoming patterns, recurrences, echoes. If the Emperor built one such arsenal, he said, then he may have built more. If he buried this one in layered denial and distributed authority, then he taught us how he hides what he fears to lose. I do not merely want what sleeps beneath Vrax. The furnace light burning through his armor flared as though the iron itself shared his revelation. I want the logic by which he concealed it. The war passed from slaughter into methodical nightmare. By then, the outer districts of Vrax were no longer recognizable as districts at all. What had once been hab clusters, gun boroughs, signal yards, shell manufactoria, processional causeways, mortuary squares, chapel, trenches, and transit vaults had been taken, broken down, and rebuilt by the Fourth into fresh layers of war. Captured bastions became forward forts before their dead garrisons had gone cold. Those forts were linked by new revetments poured from powdered masonry, fused ceramite, and corpse ash. Walls rose behind walls, each one built from the carcass of the last. Streets vanished beneath anti-tank ditches. Shrine plazas became mortar gardens. Hab spires, cut down by shell fire to blackened stumps, were armored over into range-finding towers and observation keeps. Whole districts were folded inward and reforged as siege cities, whose only purpose was to birth the next ring of attack. The moon learned the enemy's philosophy, even as it died to it. Cordac's Vul stood in the upper command vault of a newly raised redoubt that had once been a loyalist transit citadel, and looked upon the transformed horizon with a mixture of reverence and dread. The line no longer resembled an invading front. It resembled a second civilization being grown over the corpse of the first. Iron ramparts climbed over old black stone. Gun towers rose from burial mounds of smashed armor and compacted dead. Every fresh gain became at once a weapon, every weapon at once a wall, every wall at once a womb for another stronger thing. The Fourth did not merely advance, it replaced. That was when Perturabo committed his chosen. The orders ran through the assault channels with cold inevitability. Tyrant siege terminators to the primary spearhead. Iron Circle automata released from reserve penance pens. Veteran breacher companies of the old Legion to the inner transit assaults. Demon engines unchained for corridor breach action. Obliterator batteries moved forward under armored escort and given broad sanction upon all hardpoints beyond the penitent's approaches. The whole moon seemed to tense in answer. From the forward bastion galleries, Kordax watched the tyrants come on in dense blocks of gunmetal and hazard stripes, each warrior carrying enough firepower to break a bunker line alone. Cyclone racks flared overhead and filled the inner sky with contrails before the first ranks had even reached the breach routes. Their steps were slow and absolute. Nothing hurried in them. Each shell launched from their shoulder banks struck with the bored certainty of a sentence already passed. Beside them strode Iron Circle automata, vast bronze-black guardians of the Primarch's old wrath, their shields scarred by the long war, their hammer limbs flexing with piston force as though eager to punish stone itself. Breacher companies advanced in lockstep behind mobile shields and tracked mantlets, veterans whose armor still bore the relic scars of 10,000 bitter sieges. Around and between them slithered demon engines, all furnace mouths, hooked limbs, chained runes, and murder held barely in check by shrieking command seals. Behind that iron mass dragged the obliterators. Kordax never liked looking at them. They were legionaries, and no longer legionaries, men and arsenals made sick unto apotheosis. Flesh swelled around gunmetal growths, barrels pushed through forearms, ammo feeds crawled through opened bellies like intestinal serpents. One bore a last battery where his jaw should have been. Another exhaled shell casings through a slit where his throat had burst and healed wrong 100 times over. Yet when they opened fire, walls died, gates died, machine spirits died screaming in their housings. The inner defense ring of Vrax shuddered under the impact. Perturabo descended to the front, not as some beast overcome by bloodlust, but as the final intellect required to solve a problem grown worthy of his direct attention. He walked among batteries, trench towers, signal pits, breach teams, and forward command bunkers with the slow, unnatural calm of a being to whom the whole war presented itself not as confusion, but as structure. Custodes followed at a respectful distance with his surviving guard and watched the Primarch read the geometry of the defense in real time. Here, Perturabo halted a mortar battery and shifted its arc by degrees, so fine the correction looked almost insultingly small. The next salvo tore through a hidden venting tower that had been redirecting shield energy to a dead zone around the penitent's gate. There he ordered a tunnel column diverted through 3 blocks of rubble no augur had marked passable. Hours later, their emergence collapsed an entire loyalist fallback stair under the feet of retreating defenders. He watched fire patterns, wall thickness, corridor widths, the rhythm of counter-assaults, even the timing of how quickly the defenders retrieved their wounded, and from these details redrew the shape of the attack until the whole spearhead moved with greater malice and less waste. He was not fighting the fortress. He was understanding it to death. Within the sanctified depths behind the penitents, approaches, Tribune Caesar Helion answered with his own kind of perfection. The Custodes gave ground, but never as lesser armies gave ground. Each withdrawal was selected in advance, each passage measured, each stairwell chosen not because it could be held longest, but because it could best be made into a grinder. They fell back in concentric layers around the inner sanctum, and every layer they relinquished became a shrine of murder. Corridors were narrowed by demolition. Bulkheads were locked half shut to force attackers through kill channels. Side chapels were opened into crossfire nests. Dead zones were seeded with guardian spear fields, mine webs, and hidden firing recesses known only to the 10,000 and the oldest machine spirits of Vrax. Custodes saw what it did to the spearhead. Traitor thralls and auxilia died by the 100 in the outer passages, of course, but that was expected and beneath proper notice. It was what happened to the legionaries that mattered. A breacher. File forced a side corridor, only to find the space beyond empty until golden figures stepped out of smoke and cut the front half of the formation down in 6 heartbeats. Tyrant Terminators advanced through a cruciform hall under overwhelming suppressive fire, only for the floor panels beneath them to vent null flame and blinding ash, while custodians hit them from 3 directions at once, stabbing into gorgets and knee joints with impossible strength and silence. An iron circle pair breached a sanctum threshold, shields high, hammers rising, and were met by concentrated adrathic discharge from hidden murder slots that boiled away one automaton's chest and left the other stumbling forward just long enough for a custodian warden to split its sensorium like an executioner opening a skull. They were terrible beyond any rational metric. Then the Minotaurs refused every demand of prudence and made the whole struggle worse. Helion had wanted rearguard discipline, layered withdrawal, controlled denial, preservation of the sanctum approaches at all cost. Moloch chose countercharge. The Minotaurs struck not from safety, but from the mouths of half-collapsed side bastions, reserve lift shafts, and broken reliquary transepts, just as the Iron Warrior's spearhead compressed inward toward the penitent's approaches. Bronze and black came crashing into iron and hazard yellow in enclosed murder spaces already thick with corpses. Suddenly, the inner war was not 1 front, but 3. Custodes in deliberate retreat and precise slaughter from ahead. Iron warriors driving inward under Primarch-directed pressure from behind. Minotaurs smashing sideways into both the lane and the men within it. The corridors became abattoirs. Torsos clogged the threshold arches, where explosive bolts had opened men at the chest and left the upper halves jammed against the lower. Helm lenses slicked over with blood and brain matter until optics turned the world into red blur and warning runes. Hacked limbs rolled beneath iron boots, fingers still twitching, armor plates still venting sparks from severed power feeds. Chain axes oversprayed the bulkheads in diagonal fans of meat and marrow. Bolt rounds burst inside bodies at arm's length and painted the walls in gore so thick that traction failed and giants slipped in the dead. A Minotaur captain drove his boarding shield into an Iron Warrior's face and kept pushing until the skull inside the helm burst like rotten fruit. A tyrant Terminator lost both legs to a Custodian spear cut and still managed to fire one last cyclone spread from the floor, turning 3 golden warriors and half a corridor into fire and shards. A demon engine forced its hooked limbs through a shrine arch, seized 2 Minotaurs in opposite claws, and beat one against the other until both were split open from collar to hip. The war ceased to resemble anything that could be mapped cleanly. It had become impact, pressure, dismemberment, recoil, screaming machine spirits, and the wet grinding of bodies reduced under advancing weight. Perturabo entered that horror as though stepping into a workshop. Kordax saw it from a blasted gallery above the penitent's antechamber and felt the old worship fear close its talons around his hearts. The Primarch did not rage. He did not howl challenges or hurl himself at the thickest knot of enemies out of animal exultation. He chose, he assessed, he removed. A squad of custodian guards struck from a side cloister, 5 golden figures moving through smoke with the terrible grace of sacred murder. Perturabo turned toward them, lifted Forgebreaker in both hands, and met them with calm inevitability. The first custodian's guardian spear shattered at the midpoint under the descending hammer, and the warrior behind it vanished from shoulders to sternum in the same impact. The second lunged for the Primarch's flank and had his arm torn away at the socket before Perturabo drove him into the wall, hard enough to leave Auramite embedded in stone. The third and fourth came together, blades and spears flashing in perfect coordination. Perturabo caught one weapon on his forearm, broke the haft, stepped inside the other, and crushed both warriors apart in consecutive hammer blows that looked less like combat than the dismantling of defective engines. Bone, gold plate, and blood exploded outward. The last custodian managed a thrust into the gap beneath the Primarch's collar seam. Perturabo looked down at the blade in his armor, seized the warrior by the face, and pulped him against the floor with one downward movement of his arm. A Hecaton dreadnought crashed from the deeper gate behind them then, a monstrous vault guardian of old imperial make, broad as a bunker and carrying a siege blade and heavy Adrathic destructor across its sarcophagus frame. The chamber shook under its tread. Its weapons fired in the same instant, blue-white annihilation washing across the approach and reducing a whole knot of Iron Warrior breachers to ash and bursting armor. Perturabo turned toward it and advanced through the fading glare. The Hecaton struck first with its siege blade, a blow that would have split a battle tank from prow to engine. Perturabo caught the descending weapon on Forgebreaker's haft, the impact rippling out through the whole gate hall in a concussion of sparks and fractured stone. Then he moved. One hammer blow tore away the dreadnought's weapon arm at the elbow housing. Another cratered the sarcophagus chest and caved in half the engine shrine beneath. The Hecaton tried to fire again. Perturabo seized its head assembly in his left gauntlet and twisted. Pistons screamed. The entire upper sensorium tore free in his hand, trailing fire and sacred cable. He drove Forgebreaker into the exposed torso cavity 3 times in slow, methodical succession, until the machine spirit inside gave one final shriek through every open vox channel and died. All around him, legionaries and slaves alike had gone quiet for the span of those killings. Even the Minotaurs faltered in their charge lanes when the Primarch's work reached their sight. By the time Helion came to the Penitent's Gate, the outer approaches had become a grave cathedral. Bronze, gold, iron, and human remains lay heaped across the stairways in strata. Melted armor sagged from the wall panels. Broken spears and chain-blade teeth littered the floor like votive offerings to some obscene god of siege. The penitence gate itself, a black slab of null-etched adamantium rising 3 stories high, stood scorched and cracked but unbreached, its seals glowing sullen red where the latest impact cycle had stressed them to the edge of collapse. Helion strode down the final stair with the survivors of his chosen around him. They were fewer now, much fewer. Every one of them wore damage enough to have killed a lesser demigod twice over. Their auramite was blackened, their cloaks were torn, their weapons dripped blood or machine oil or things fouler than either. Yet they moved with the old, unbent certainty of their order. Perturabo turned to face them. For a breath, the wider battle seemed to draw back from the confrontation, as lesser things instinctively yield space to greater judgments. Cordax, watching from the side ruin of a demolished sentry shrine, felt the whole war tighten around that moment. Helion removed his helm. His face was pale beneath blood spray and ash. One cheek had been split to the bone and sealed in haste by battlefield foam. His eyes held no fear, only the cold and ancient disgust of one made to stand closest to the Emperor, and therefore to know betrayal when he saw it. "You were made to build his dominion," Helion said. "You chose instead to besiege his corpse." Perturabo regarded him for a long moment. The furnace glow in his armor seams pulsed once, twice, like the breathing of a forge. "No," the Primarch said. "I chose to understand what he built. That is why I will take it from you." Then they came together. Cordax would remember only fragments cleanly thereafter, because such violence at that scale resisted proper sequence. Helion striking first with the point of his spear, seeking a joint line at the Primarch's throat. Perturabo, turning the thrust aside with the haft of Forgebreaker and driving forward with shoulder and mass, enough to break the formation of the custodian survivors. Gold closing in from both flanks. Iron circle hammers intercepting. Minotaurs roaring back into the hall from a side breach to exploit the collision. Bolter detonations strobing the chamber red. Spears and axes and chain blades rising through smoke thick with atomized blood. The penitent seals shrieking as breacher charges placed in earlier phases of the assault finally answered their trigger rights in coordinated sequence. The gate failed inward, not outward, like a fortress beaten from the front. Inward, because the supports had been murdered with such precision that the whole monumental slab folded into the dark beyond under its own impossible weight. Dust, sparks, and null-lit fragments of broken sealwork billowed through the hall. The shockwave threw bodies from their feet and sent a rain of powdered black stone across the slaughter ground. When the smoke rolled back, the first sight of the Basilicon vault stood revealed. It was not a chamber, but a buried world. A cavern of black stone yawned beyond the shattered threshold, vast enough to drown armies in its dark. Null pylons rose from the depths like the teeth of some titanic machine, each one webbed in dead lightning and ward light. Chained sun engines hung in suspension over abyssal shafts, captive spheres of old and murderous radiance bound in adamant frames, their glow throttled down to embers by seals and force lattices older than most empires. Across terraced vault floors and descending galleries slept engines of continent-killing purpose beneath imperial sigils, mountain-sized cylinders, cathedral guns, black pyramidal devices caged in prayer chains, and archaeotech masses whose function was so terrible that even looking upon them felt like trespass. All of it waited under the Emperor's seals. All of it waited in darkness, made sacred by fear. The war became smaller, and therefore more terrible. Outside the Basilicon vault, the siege still raged across districts, trench worlds, and broken fortresses with the impersonal enormity of planetary murder. Guns still hammered the black skin of Vrax. Men still died by the Legion in causeways, breach fields, and shell pits. Whole batteries still vanished under counterfire, or lived just long enough to fire once more before becoming scrap and gore. Yet within the vault, approaches all of that immensity narrowed into something sharper. The distances closed, the numbers fell away. There were fewer bodies here, but each body now wore plate sanctified by ancient oath, or forged in the bitterness of the long war, or anointed by the will of terror, or bound in demon iron for a single decisive purpose. Every corridor was sacred, every stair was chosen, every door was history. Every mistake could unmake not a trench line, nor a bastion, but the hidden logic of an age. The first galleries beyond the shattered penitence gate descended in wide terraces of black stone and gold-lit warding script. Null pylons rose between the approaches like the vertebrae of some buried colossus, their surfaces drinking sound and shivering with leashed suppression fields. Vault machinery the size of cathedrals slumbered in alcoves behind adamant grills. Suspensor chains hung down into abyssal shafts, each link engraved with kill cants and authority seals. Beneath every surface breathed the weight of a secret too dangerous to speak plainly. Tribune Caesar Helion knew, the instant he beheld the opened sanctum in full, that there would be no restoration. From this point onward, the vault had been seen. That fact alone had already become a wound. He gathered the surviving custodes at the edge of the central approach, where broken statuary and the corpses of the first assault still smoked. They came to him in silence, gold plate blackened and gashed, cloaks torn to ribbons, guardian spears chipped and caked dark. He counted them with one glance, and did not permit himself the luxury of grief. There were too few. Yet there had always been too few, measured against the things worth preserving. Helion stood before the great descending avenue that led toward the induction dais and the lower sancta, and removed his damaged helm. Blood had dried along one side of his face. The skin beneath was pale and hard as worked ivory. "This is the true choice," he said. No one answered. None were expected to. If the arsenal cannot be held, it will be destroyed utterly, not hidden, not disputed, not reclaimed, destroyed. The Emperor's secrets matter more than worlds, more than armies, more than our lives. If we cannot deny this place to his enemies, then we deny it to history itself. One of the wardens, his left pauldron torn half away, and one eye lens cracked to darkness, inclined his head. As on terror, Helion said. There was no dissent among the 10,000. There never had been in matters of first principle. They turned at once to their assigned stations. Some took the upper galleries. Some moved to the side sancta through passageways only they and the oldest vault spirits knew. Helion himself gathered the largest remnant around the central induction route, because he had already judged where the enemy would strike hardest once they understood enough to be truly dangerous. Asterion Moloch heard the declaration and rejected it at once. He had come down into the vault with the survivors of his Terminator cohorts and the hardcore of the Minotaur's veteran line, bronze-armored killers. Spattered with the blood of traitors and brothers alike, their war plates scarred to raw metal by the inward war at the penitence approaches. They looked wrong amid the ancient severity of the place, too brutal, too immediate, too much the mailed hand of current power forced into chambers built for an older and colder authority. Moloch halted at the first split in the descent, where one avenue led toward the blood sancta and the other toward the induction heart. He listened to Helion's judgment and then spoke without waiting for permission. "No." The word cracked across the chamber like a shot. Helion turned, slowly. "You presume?" "I decide," Moloch said. "If these are truly weapons of the Emperor's own age, then the High Lords may judge them too valuable to erase." "The High Lords," said Helion, "do not sit above the trust laid upon us here." Moloch stepped forward. His armor dripped blood from the lower plates in slow black strings. Everything in the Imperium sits beneath necessity. Necessity is why this place must die if it cannot be held. No, that is your doctrine speaking through fear. Helian's gaze did not waver, and yours speaks through hunger. The Minotaurs stirred at that. Weapons did not rise, but grips tightened. Bronze helmets turned fractionally. Across the gallery, the surviving Custodes neither shifted nor voiced warning, which made the silence all the more murderous. Moloch gave a scar-thin smile. Do you think me eager to kneel before hidden relics and beg them to save us? I would burn 100 worlds to buy an advantage the throne can still use. If these engines can break fortress realms, sunder fleets, or scour traitor empires from the stars, they should be judged in the light of rule, not destroyed because you fear contamination by possession. I do not fear possession, Helian said. I despise the species that always mistakes possession for worth. It almost began there. Custodes and Minotaurs physically blocked one another in the vault approach chambers, not yet striking, but setting shoulders, shields, and spears across the avenues by which the vault could be reached. Orders were shouted, then repeated through helm vox. Bronze bulk met Auramite. One Minotaur veteran shoved against a custodian sentinel to force passage toward the blood sanctum, and was thrown backward with such controlled force that he struck a pillar hard enough to crack the stone. His brothers surged one step in answer. Guardian spear points lowered. Power axes came free. The whole chamber drew to the edge of civil murder, while, somewhere above and behind them, the traitor assault gathered breath. Perturabo exploited the split exactly as Helian had feared. The Primarch had not been idle, while the loyalists contested doctrine in the Emperor's dark. He did not need perfect knowledge of their words. He needed only the delay, the pressure change in the defense pattern, the slight irregularity in how the inner corridors were being held. His augurs, prisoners, and instinctive reading of the war told him enough. He drove the wedge in at once. Iron Circle automata led, their shield walls locked, their hammers raised, not in fury, but in exact anticipation of the confined slaughter ahead. Behind them came Tyrant Siege Terminators, advancing shoulder to shoulder in files so dense their own bulk scraped the corridor walls. Demon engines followed on chains until the final release command. Veteran breacher companies moved in the gaps like surgical muscle between armored bones. The whole spearhead hit the vault approaches at the instant the loyalists were still obstructing one another, and hesitation became catastrophe. The first impact blew the side barricades apart. Iron Circle shields smashed through a Minotaur holding line at the Blood Sanctum branch and sent bronze-armored giants crashing into custodian fallback marks they had only moments before been trying to overrule. Tyrant missiles filled the upper galleries with screaming contrails, detonating against statuary, null pylons, and murder slots alike. Breacher melter charges turned the side walls white-hot and sent sheets of half-liquid black stone sloughing down over anyone too slow to move. Then the demon engines were loosed, and the sacred avenues of the Basilicon Vault became killing throats. Here the battle no longer had room for grand maneuver. It had only room for impact. Bolter detonations became avalanches. One mass-reactive shell burst against a carved support saint, and the entire overhanging gallery collapsed in a cataract of stone, crushing Minotaurs, legionaries, and servitors into indistinguishable ruin. A gravitic surge from a wounded relic machine rolled outward in a blue pulse and pulped men inside their armor, turning bodies into broken sacks while leaving the ceramite around them almost untouched. Power weapons sheared through auramite and bronze alike. The old materials of loyalty and the brutal alloys of High Lord's force rendered equally mortal beneath enough energy and strength. Null engines screamed as they were struck, causing vox collapse, nosebleeds, and sudden blindness in mortals deeper within the vault infrastructure. Melted armor ran across the steps like wax from funeral candles. Blood mist hung in the heavy air and turned every lumen into a wounded halo. Moloch took the center of that inferno and made it his own. An Iron Warrior champion in cataphractii plate, his armor stitched with siege sigils and demon script, barreled down the main avenue with a chain fist whirling and a combi bolter blazing. Moloch met him head-on, weathered the bolter impacts against his chestplate, batted the chain fist wide with his shield edge, and drove his axe up through the traitor's gorget hard enough to tear the head free inside the helm. He ripped the weapon back down, opened the champion from throat to sternum, and hurled the corpse into the file behind him. A second champion, one of the old Legion Breacher captains, came from the side with a power maul and boarding shield. Moloch let the maul strike his shoulder guard, stepped into the blow before its full force could bloom, and hammered the traitor's face into the wall until helm, skull, and black stone became one crushed thing. Then a demon engine lunged through the smoke, all claws, furnace maw, and cable whip limbs. It hit 2 Minotaurs and threw them in opposite directions, one dead before he struck the ground, the other screaming through a ruined vox grill as his legs trailed behind him in red ruin. Moloch turned on the beast at point-blank range, ignored the heat blasting from its maw, and charged it before it could fully gather itself. The machine thing snapped at him. He drove his shield into its jaw hinge and forced the mouth wide. Its claws raked his cuirass, peeling bronze away in strips. He took the wounds, buried his axe in the demon, engine's faceplate, then dropped the weapon entirely, seized the split metal with both gauntlets, and tore the front of the creature apart by brute force. Warp fire burst from its opened furnace throat and washed over him. He did not yield. He reached into the boiling heart of it, found whatever passed for spine in that unclean mechanism, and ripped it free in a gout of black flame and machine blood. Even the Iron Warriors nearest him recoiled at that. This was why Astartes feared his name, not because he was noble, not because he was wise, but because some men were made into weapons so thoroughly that even transhuman killers sensed the wrongness of standing too close. While Moloch held the center in roaring brutality, Hellion fought where the war actually mattered. The induction dais lay below the main terraces, a circular platform of black stone surrounded by concentric control plinths, caged data columns, broken statuary, and the vast rootwork of the Vault's master machine, Logic. Above it hung force lines and sanctified cables descending from unseen heights. Around it rose the final defensive ring. If the induction heart fell intact, the Vault's deeper command schema could be touched. Not mastered, not yet, but touched. That alone was unforgivable. Hellion gathered the remnants of the Custodes there and planted them in a narrowing gold line around the dais. The enemy came at them in waves of elite hatred. Tyrants first, marching through smoke and shrapnel with missile racks emptying overhead. Then breachers behind mobile shields. Then iron circle pairs, hammers cracking the floor and sending shockwaves through the dead. The Custodes held. They killed as they always killed, without waste, without posturing, with the concentrated certainty of a sacred office fulfilled. Hellion split an iron circle hammer arm at the elbow, thrust through the automaton's chest cavity, and used the collapsing bulk as cover against the fire of the tyrants advancing behind. A warden beside him lost his right leg at the knee and simply dropped to one knee to maintain the line, carving apart the first breacher to come within reach, and then the second, before a missile burst, tore him to pieces. Another custodian, impaled through the torso by a demon-forged pike, still managed to drag his killer close enough for Hellion to take the traitor's head. Black smoke climbed over ruptured statuary. Corpse heaps rose around the dais in mounds of 10,000 failures. Gold plate became red-black, where blood and ash sealed upon it. One by one, the Custodes fell back by steps, so measured they might as well have been engraved in advance. They were winning time, and nothing more. Then the vault itself woke halfway. No warning rite preceded it. No full awakening litany sounded. One of the basilicon engines, deeper below the induction rootwork, suffered too much stress under the layered detonations, gravitic surges, damaged seals, and violated control harmonies. Its containment scripture flared from dormant gold to white. The chains around its caged mass drew taut with a scream of tortured metal. For a heartbeat, all nearby machine spirits wailed in unison. Then, the engine discharged. The blast did not resemble normal fire. It was a sphere of compressed, impossible radiance that burst outward through the lower galleries and rose through the vault like a captive sun trying to remember creation. Whole formations vanished in it. A wedge of iron warrior terminators nearest the root chamber was reduced to ash shadows on black stone. 3 custodes on the eastern stairs disappeared so completely their absence looked blasphemous against the slaughter around it. A Minotaur squad in the central gallery became burning silhouettes, then nothing. The null pylons nearest the surge cracked and bled dead lightning across the chamber. Far below, where millions of lesser men still fought and worked in the transit levels and shell routes feeding the assault, the engine's vented fury rolled through service shafts and cargo descents like divine punishment. Flesh boiled, eyes burst. Oceans of human bodies were flash-cooked where they stood, their screams ending before sound could properly form. For several stunned heartbeats, every living thing in the vault was lit in white. When the light collapsed back into its shattered cage, the battle resumed at once, madder than before. Perturabo moved through the aftermath personally. He had not committed himself to mindless contest in the approach fighting. He had let his sons, engines, and chosen killers spend themselves first while he read the vault's reactions. Now, amid scorched ruin and half-awakened apocalypse, he descended toward the damaged command interfaces the discharge had exposed. He moved through broken stone and dead elite warriors as if they were merely the debris field left by a useful experiment. Helion saw him and broke from the line. Their clash on the lower approach was brief and ruinous. Helion struck for the Primarch's visor seam and hip joint with the kind of precision only his order could bring to such hopeless work. Perturabo turned each attempt aside with brutal economy, his hammer and gauntlet never wasting movement. Helion managed one thrust deep into a vent gap beneath the demon-forged breastplate. Black-red furnace blood hissed out. Perturabo answered by smashing the custodian aside with a backhand from Forgebreaker that sent him skidding across the induction steps in a storm of sparks and shattered stone. Helion rose anyway. He rose because that was what he was. But he was too late to stop the theft. At the far side of the dais, where the discharge had cracked open a subsidiary command shrine and exposed layers of sealed mechanism beneath, Perturabo reached into the vault's wounded logic and took what he had come for. Not the whole arsenal. Even he could not seize that in the teeth of denial and ruin, but a vault core, black and heavy with chained data cylinders and memory architecture older than most Starside empires, came free beneath his hands. Along with it, he tore partial command schema from the ruptured interfaces, fragments only, pieces of induction lore, blood seal logic, and design grammar compressed into machine script reliquaries and living code slivers. He did not smile. He simply looked at the stolen thing in his grasp, as a mathematician might look upon proof. Helion, bleeding inside his armor, understood the scale of the wound at once. "Begin denial," he voxed. Far away, in sanctums already prepared for this last obedience, the first stages of Vrax's self-scourging protocols awoke. Deep reactors altered their prayer cycles. Buried demolition choirs received authority pulses. Void shield harmonics reversed. Sacred coolant lines locked. The moon did not yet begin to die, but it inhaled for the act. Across the vault, amid black smoke, dead gold, dead bronze, and mountains of iron ruin, warning runes bloomed in old imperial red. The Basilicon vault had not been saved, but neither had it been surrendered whole. The death of Vrax began below ground. It began in sealed chambers and reactor crypts and denial sanctums where ancient machine spirits, obedient for millennia, received the first impossible order and accepted it without complaint. Coolant prayers reversed, pressure gates locked against their own attendants, blessed turbines spun beyond safe catechism and climbed towards sacred failure. Deep in the moon's hidden bones, sanctum locks overloaded in chains of red warning light and screaming iron, each one handing catastrophe onward to the next, with the calm precision of a rite long prepared for and never once doubted. Above, the fortress still appeared to live. Its guns still fired, its trenches still writhed, its battered walls still vomited smoke and defenders and ordnance into the poisoned heavens. Yet the life in it had changed. Anti-orbital batteries, cut from coherent command by the self-scourging of the Basilicon systems, began to swivel blindly upon their pivots and fire at ghosts. One lance crown burned a hole through the wreckage field of its own upper bastions. A ring battery on the Ashward Hemisphere turned skyward and discharged through a cluster of loyalist and traitor vessels alike, opening ships from keel to spine in blooms of furnace-white ruin. On the shell plains above the breached districts, trenches collapsed inward as the support routes beneath them failed. Whole stretches of the line sank into flaming sinkholes full of the half-buried dead, swallowing gun teams, wounded men, ammunition trains, and crawling survivors in the same sudden mouth of fire. The moon was beginning to scour itself clean. Within the vault, Tribune Caesar Helion saw the warning runes bloom over black stone and knew the choice had passed beyond theory forever. There would be no salvaging what remained. There would be no recovery under other hands, no later judgment by distant masters, no pious fantasy of reclaiming the Emperor's hidden wrath and turning it neatly upon his foes. The vault had been breached. Its deeper logic had been touched. Its sanctity was now measured only by what could still be denied. He gathered the remnants of the 10,000 around the lower induction approaches. There were so few of them now that any mortal commander would have mistaken their task for madness. Gold plate was blackened and split. One custodian bore an arm hanging useless from cables and broken bone, held to his side only by the stiffness of the armor sleeve. Another had no helm and no left eye, the ruined socket sealed by blood and cauterized flesh. A third leaned for one heartbeat on his guardian spear, before straightening again, merely to remind his own damaged body who ruled it. Helion did not speak to them of sacrifice. He did not speak of glory. Those were words for lesser breeds that needed decoration hung upon. Necessity. He said only this: total annihilation. No one questioned him. The remaining arsenal would die. The sanctum architecture would die. The machine memory beneath the machine memory would die if force enough could be brought to bear. Whatever had not already been stolen would be rendered into slag, blind code, cooked isotopes, and sacred ash. If the Emperor's secret could no longer be held inviolate, then the final obedience was not preservation, it was refusal. The Custodes turned to the work of ending worlds with the same calm exactitude they had once brought to guarding them. Charges were set where no outsider had known charges existed. Seal pylons were overloaded by bloodrite and authority cant spoken in voices bred for command. Induction sub-shrines were uncoupled from their safety harmonics. Null engines were forced toward mutually destructive resonance. Helion himself moved to the final denial plinth beneath the central induction route, where a hidden engine would require the exact sequence of command, blood, and sustained presence to complete the cycle. It was not a place from which anyone sane would expect to return. Asterion Moloch rejected retreat for a different reason entirely. He had wanted the arsenal judged, not burned. He had wanted it dragged into the hard daylight of necessity and made to answer to the Imperium's living hunger. Yet once the denial began, once the vault itself started to shiver and crack around them, even he understood there would be no recovering the whole of what had been hidden here. At that point, the choice changed shape. No longer between preservation and destruction, but between ordered destruction and theft beneath the ruin. The Minotaurs chose the harder work. They became the movable wall. Bronze-armored survivors spread through collapsing bridges, lift shafts, transit galleries, and side sancta approaches with a savage practicality that had nothing of holiness in it and everything of function. Where the Custodes turned inward to finish the refusal, the Minotaurs turned outward and held the ways by which the refusal might yet be interrupted. They planted themselves in galleries already shaking apart. They fortified stair mouths with wrecked servitor shells and the bodies of the dead. They held hanging bridges over abyssal machine shafts, while sections of the span buckled and dropped screaming men into lightless depth. They fought in lift cages, half torn from their rails, using the wrecks as barricades, while gravitic failures made the whole structures lurch and groan beneath them. They did not do it nobly. They did it brutally. A Minotaur squad at the third transit throat held until the deck under them split and vented furnace breath from below, cooking one warrior alive inside his plate, while his brothers continued firing over the smoking shell of him. Another team locked shields across a maintenance bridge and let an Iron Warrior Terminator charge break against them so they could drag the traitor down with them when the bridge finally sheared away. In the Blood Sanctum galleries, they fought ankle-deep in hot runoff and ruptured gene fluid, bronze armor smeared dark by sacred matter and enemy ruin alike, their power weapons rising and falling with the ugly discipline of men bred for sanctioned atrocity. Moloch moved through those collapsing lanes like the spirit of that work made flesh. He did not seek survival. He did not need the illusion of possible triumph. He understood what stood behind him and what came toward him. He knew the scale of both and chose his place regardless. The Minotaurs would rather be broken in the path of a god than live having yielded that path unchallenged. There was no poetry in the decision. It was simply the one left to men of their making. The Iron Warriors came on without pause. Perturabo had no intention of contesting every corridor. He had planned for partial victory from the beginning. The Vault Core was his. Fragments of command schema were his. Observational data enough to redraw the logic of hidden Imperial denial had already been torn free and sent upward in shielded reliquary canisters. Yet he still advanced, because the difference between partial victory and diminished victory might be measured in one more machine memory shard, one more active seal sequence, one more glimpse of how the Emperor had buried his deeper arsenals across the stars. So the fourth drove inward through the failing vault, beneath the eye of their Primarch. Iron circle automata pounded through side approaches, still slick with gold and bronze blood. Veteran breachers cut through blocked transit shafts with melter torches and chain cutters, while demon engines crawled over the ceilings of the wider galleries, leaving hooked claw marks across black stone and sacred iconography. Tyrant siege terminators fired down corridors so cramped the backblast flayed skin from the faces of nearby thralls. Obliterator detachments fed living gunflesh into the dying architecture and shot open chambers no machine spirit had expected to see violated. Everywhere the denial advanced, the assault followed it, like a beast trying to outrun a fire through its own lair. At the lower bridge approaches, Moloch finally met Perturabo. There had been lesser collisions between their forces before, smaller brushes of bronze against iron directed by captains and line killers. This was different. This was the true measure. The bridge itself spanned a shaft so deep, its bottom had no visible end. Only distant mechanism glows, and the slow movement of chained vault masses far below. One side of the span had already slumped and cracked, where overloads in the support pylons were propagating. Fires burned in the fissures. Behind Moloch lay the final liftway to the induction route. Before him came Perturabo, through smoke, dead iron, and the broken bodies of his own sons. Moloch did not hesitate. He charged with the last of his Terminator bodyguard around him, a bronze wedge reduced almost to a single thought. Bolter fire cracked from his flanks. A companion on his right vanished under the hammer blow of an iron circle automaton before the wedge had crossed half the span. Another was ripped from the bridge by a demon engine's hooked limb and hurled screaming into the shaft. Still, Moloch came on. Perturabo met him as a fortress meets weather. That was the difference. Not merely of strength, though the Primarch possessed strength enough to make mockery of any Astartes duel. Not merely of speed, though his blows crossed impossible ground in instants that made lesser transhumans seem clumsy. The difference was mass of being. Moloch was horrifying by the standard of his kind, a weapon hammered beyond reason into the shape of a commander. Perturabo was something far above that scale, a demon Primarch, an engine of war whose very presence altered how battle arranged itself around him. Moloch struck first and, well, his axe bit sparks from the Primarch's forearm guard. His shield slammed forward with a force that would have pulped a dreadnought sarcophagus. Perturabo yielded one half step, and no more. Forgebreaker came down once and shattered Moloch's shield from rim to heart. The second blow took one of the Minotaur bodyguard through helm and breastplate in a single ruinous impact. Moloch roared and hacked again, this time drawing a line of furnace blood from the Primarch's flank seam. For that, he earned the full weight of Perturabo's regard. The Primarch drove him backward in 3 blows. One crushed Moloch's axe haft near the grip. One smashed his left shoulder so hard, the entire pauldron burst loose and spun away into the abyss. The last struck him square in the chest and hurled him the length of the bridge. Bronze ceramite shattered. He hit the deck hard enough to crack the black stone beneath him and lay there for one impossible heartbeat, while his armor tried and failed to. Remember, it was whole. Then he rose. That was what made him monstrous. He rose with half his cuirass stove in and one arm trailing useless, blood pouring from the grill of his helm, and he stepped back into the path of the Primarch anyway. No expectation of victory lived in that act. Only refusal. Perturabo almost killed him then. He seized Moloch by the throat, lifted him from the bridge, and began to close his gauntlet. Bronze buckled. Internal braces screamed. Moloch struck at the Primarch's wrist with the jagged remnant of his axe and accomplished nothing. The difference between them was no longer a duel. It was the difference between a fortress and a man. Only the collapse of the bridge saved him from immediate death. The denial charges propagating through the shaft supports finally reached that span. Black stone split. The central section fell away in a shrieking rain of debris, dead warriors, and broken support iron. Perturabo released Moloch to preserve his own footing and vaulted backward onto the still intact portion of the span. Moloch crashed onto a tilted remnant nearer the induction side, rolled through flame and rubble, and slammed into the far parapet, hard enough to leave bronze plate buried in the stone. He did not rise again at once. He did not need to. He had bought heartbeats. Nothing more. Everything. Deeper below, Helion was already spending those heartbeats with perfect knowledge of their cost. The final denial plinth stood in a chamber beneath the induction route, half machine vault and half shrine crypt, circled by failing null rings and descending curtains of data light gone ragged with overload. The engine at its heart was ancient beyond reverence, a black cord machine nested in command thrones, sacrificial conduits, and auric logic cylinders sealed behind layers of authority older than the current Imperium itself. It had to be guided into self-scourging, not merely detonated. Too crude a death would leave too much recoverable structure. The cycle required command presence, blood right, and an unbroken sequence held through the full span of collapse harmonics. Helion took his place before it and keyed the right. The chamber shook. Warning runes climbed toward terminal crimson. Deep elsewhere in the vault, other denial engines answered in chainage. The remaining custodes formed a shrinking ring around him, while iron warriors battered their way through the approach sancta. There was no drama in Helion's choice, no glorious challenge cast into the air for the enemy to admire. He stood at his post, because the right required a living will to hold it steady. If he moved too soon, the sequence would fail. If he died too soon, the sequence would fail. So he measured the war not in abstractions, but in the exact number of heartbeats still needed. The traitors broke through. Breach charges tore open the first side wall. Iron Circle fragments stumbled in from the smoke, one half molten from the neck down, the other still lethal enough to kill 2 Custodes before Helion's guard tore it apart. A demon engine forced its furnace head through the upper transept and vomited black fire across the chamber, cooking one golden warrior where he stood. Tyrant Terminators fired blindly through the smoke and turned statuary, warding columns and living bodies alike into a grinding storm of metal and stone. The Custodes did not yield. They died in place, one after another, each buying another heartbeat. Helion did not watch them. He watched the sequence. 17 heartbeats remained when the first Iron Warrior reached the steps below the plinth. Helion drew his Misericordia with his offhand and killed the legionary without taking his gaze from the command stream. 14 remained when a missile burst stripped half the chamber wall away and filled the air with shards that rang from his armor like rain on a shrine roof. 12 remained when the last warden at his right was crushed beneath a daemon engine claw and still managed to drive his broken spear into the beast's eye cluster before he died. 8 remained when Perturabo himself appeared at the upper threshold, vast and dark against the furnace storm, the stolen vault core already mag-locked against his back like a second hunched heart. Helion understood then that the Primarch would not reach him in time, not because the way was barred by glory. There was no glory left here, because enough dead still lay between them, because Moloch had spent his body properly above, because every earlier refusal, every ugly obstruction and hateful argument and sacrifice measured in utility alone had accumulated into this final delay. 5 heartbeats. Perturabo came on through the ruin, crushing a fallen null pylon under 1 foot, forgebreaker in hand. 3. An Iron Circle remnant lurched toward the plinth and was cut down by the last surviving custodian, who took the automaton's hammer through his own chest in the same instant. 2. Helion placed his bleeding palm upon the final seal field and spoke the last authority cant. 1. The denial engine completed its cycle. It did not explode like a common reactor. It inverted. The chamber's light collapsed inward to a point of impossible darkness at the machine's heart, then burst outward in concentric rings of annihilating force that raced through the vault rootworks and command architecture in perfect obedience. Data cores flash-burned, logic cylinders ruptured into white ash, seal chains vaporized, sanctum locks detonated in sequence, archaeotech masses deeper in the vault were seized by linked destruction rites and turned against themselves with catastrophic precision. Helion died in that light exactly as he had lived in that moment, as function. Above and beyond the vault, Vrax began to perish in stages of apocalyptic grandeur. Continents cracked where the moon's deep bones failed under the denial chain. Whole fortress districts sheared, loose, and slid into magma wounds opening from beneath. Arsenals cooked off in linked infernos that turned mountain ranges into expanding fire crowns. Void shields burst outward like suns, their overfed harmonics tearing fleets apart at close range and bleaching the dark with actinic ruin. Transit hives sank. Mine cathedrals folded in on themselves. Trench systems hundreds of kilometers long collapsed and became lines of flame visible from orbit. Billions of slaves, serfs, penal bodies, overseers, engineers, gun crews, wounded and wandering lost, vanished without elegy beneath falling stone, boiling air, and the pure indifference of industrial apocalypse. In the void around the dying moon, ships broke away under emergency thrust, while others were caught in the blast webs and opened like sacrificial offerings before the stars. The Iron Warriors lost millions and called the price acceptable. The Defenders lost almost everything and called the denial accomplished. Moloch lived. Barely. He was dragged from a collapsing induction lift by the last of his surviving guard, bronze plate torn open, ribs showing through split flesh where medici foam hissed and blackened. He woke long enough to see the custodian extraction columns moving with almost nothing left of their former strength, carrying no treasure, no recovered wonder, no visible triumph. Only survivors and the cold certainty that what had remained had not been surrendered whole. Helion was not among them. Neither side spoke to the other in that withdrawal. They did not need to. The contempt had hardened into permanence. The Custodes blamed the Minotaurs for daring to place appetite and political claim above perfect denial, for obstructing judgment at the edge of the abyss and almost turning sacred refusal into civil bloodshed. The Minotaurs blamed the Custodes for burning what might have armed the Imperium against 1,000 future horrors, for mistaking solitary guardianship for the right to erase. Strategic salvation. Both were right enough to hate. Both were too bloodied to continue the argument beneath a dying moon. And Perturabo, despite all the ruin, had won the thing he had truly planned to win. Not total possession, not full command of the Basilicon arsenal. Those had never been reliable assumptions once the denial vectors became clear. What he had taken was enough. The vault core survived, shielded within layered iron and demonic insulation. The partial command schemata survived in encoded reliquaries. The observational data of Vrax's architecture, seal logic, denial sequencing, command redundancies, and hidden imperial design grammar survived most of all. He had seen how the Emperor hid. He had seen how one buried arsenal had been thought into existence and into secrecy. The wall had not yielded wholly, but it had revealed the mathematics of its making. Aboard the Iron Blood, in a strategium lit by furnace glow and the cold light of conquered machine memory, the salvaged core was mounted upon a suspended frame of black iron. Cables fed into it like feeding tubes into a stolen organ. It hung over the chamber as a dark mechanical heart, heavy with imprisoned logic and the dying echoes of Vrax. Warsmith Kordax Vul stood below it, rebuilt enough to kneel, broken enough to understand the privilege of still being useful. Around him, the inner circle of the Fourth waited in silence, while the image of the sundered moon rotated above the hololith cradle, split by ruin, haloed by debris, its surface still flowering with the last eruptions of denial. Perturabo did not look upon the destruction with triumph. Triumph was for simpler creatures. He studied. His gaze moved between the dying moon and the mounted core, already measuring correspondences, already following hidden chains outward through the galaxy, already laying siege in his mind to places no map yet named. Behind the horned severity of his demon-forged helm, there was no satisfaction, only continuation. At last he spoke. "Add Vrax to the wall. Terror remains.